A deaf man stepped onto the stage of Time's America's Got Story Times, and for the first time, the audience heard nothing. Confusion spread. Whispers grew. Then, from the front row, Keanu Reeves stood up, walked toward him, and signed 3 words that froze the entire studio. No one expected what happened next. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The lights of the studio burned bright against the polished floor, reflecting the excitement of a live television night. America's Got Story had become a phenomenon across the country. Every week, millions of viewers tuned in to see ordinary people share stories that touched the soul or stirred laughter. On this night, the theater was filled to capacity. The crowd rippled with anticipation, waving signs and holding phones ready to capture the next viral moment. A smooth voice echoed from the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next storyteller." The audience cheered as the camera swooped across the crowd, capturing faces of children, veterans, and couples holding hands. Backstage, the next contestant took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. Ethan Rivera, 28 years old, stood behind the curtain wearing a crisp white shirt and a blue vest that had seen better days. His heart pounded so hard that he could feel it echo in his chest. He wasn't here for fame. He wasn't here for applause. He was here for something much deeper. The curtain rose. Ethan stepped into the light. The sudden glare made his eyes narrow, but he held his ground. His steps were careful, deliberate. When he reached the center of the stage, he didn't reach for a microphone. He didn't adjust his earpiece. He simply smiled at the audience and began to move his hands. His gestures were graceful, deliberate, poetic. He was telling a story, but no sound came out. The theater that had moments ago been filled with cheering fell completely silent. People blinked in confusion. A few leaned forward, trying to understand. Ethan continued to sign, his face expressive, his eyes bright. The movement of his hands painted invisible pictures in the air. To him, every motion was a sentence, every expression a punctuation mark. But to most of the audience, it was an unfamiliar language. A few seconds passed before murmurs began to rise like a slow tide. One of the judges, a popular radio host named Rick Lawson, frowned slightly. He leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "Is this part of the act?" The microphone picked it up faintly, causing the question to echo through the room. The crowd chuckled nervously. Another judge, Maya Collins, shook her head gently. "I think he's deaf," she said quietly, her voice soft with realization. Ethan could feel the shift, the laughter, the confusion, the weight of misunderstanding pressing down on him. Still, he kept going. His story was about his grandfather, a man who had fought through silence after losing his voice in war. Ethan's hands mimed a rifle, a letter, a beating heart. Every gesture told a chapter, but the meaning was trapped between him and the world watching. In the front row, Keanu Reeves sat quietly, half hidden in the shadows of the studio lights. He had been invited as a surprise guest judge, meant to bring star power to the show. He wore a simple black blazer, his long hair tied loosely behind his neck, eyes focused and unreadable. He didn't fidget. He didn't whisper. He just watched. The subtle tension in his expression showed he understood something the others didn't. Ethan reached the emotional peak of his story. His movements became slower. His expression filled with pain. His fingers traced the shape of a heart, then opened into a gesture of release, an invisible goodbye. The audience sat in uncertain silence. Some clapped out, of politeness, unsure if it was over. Others whispered, "What's happening?" The host glanced toward the production booth, waiting for a cue to move on. Keanu leaned forward. His eyes softened as he recognized the meaning behind the gestures. He had seen that same expression before when he volunteered at a children's rehabilitation center years ago. There was no mistaking it. Ethan wasn't performing. He was speaking. He was sharing something sacred, using the only voice he had ever known. But the confusion in the room was rising fast. The director's voice crackled through the crew headsets. Cut to commercial? The assistant producer hesitated. We can't just cut him off. He's still going. On stage, Ethan began to notice the shifting faces, the uncomfortable laughter. His heart sank. He had practiced this moment for months. He had imagined the audience leaning in, not pulling away. He had believed his story would bridge the gap between silence and sound. Now, as he looked into the blinding lights, he felt the heavy loneliness that had followed him since childhood creeping back. From the corner of his eye, he saw a faint movement. Someone standing up. At first, he thought it was a crew member. But then, as his gaze adjusted, he saw who it was. Keanu Reeves. Calm, steady, with that unmistakable stillness he carried everywhere. The crowd turned, realizing it too. Whispers filled the room like wind through tall grass. What's he doing? Keanu didn't look at them. His eyes stayed on Ethan. Slowly, he walked toward the stage. The cameras scrambled to follow, operators rushing to capture every step. The showrunner shouted through the control room, "Keep it rolling! Do not cut!" Ethan froze, unsure of what was happening. The last thing he expected was for a Hollywood actor, someone he had admired from afar, to be walking toward him in the middle of his silent performance. Keanu climbed the few steps to the stage and stopped, just a few feet away. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The studio was utterly still. Keanu lifted his hands. His movements were fluid, practiced, and deliberate. He began to sign. The gestures were simple but unmistakable. "I understand you," the crowd gasped. Judges leaned forward in disbelief. The host covered her mouth, eyes wide. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as his eyes met Keanu's. For the first time that night, he didn't feel alone on that stage. The air seemed to shift. Silence no longer felt empty. It felt alive. Keanu signed again, slowly, gently. Ethan's trembling hands moved in response. The two began a silent exchange, a conversation beyond sound, broadcast to millions of viewers who had no idea what was being said but knew something profound was happening. The host, unable to contain the moment, whispered into her mic, "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're witnessing something extraordinary." The audience, unsure how to react, stayed perfectly still. Cameras zoomed in on Keanu's hands as they moved with confidence. For those who knew sign language, the message was clear. For everyone else, it was mystery and magic unfolding in real time. In the control booth, the producer lowered his headset. "Forget commercials," he muttered. "We're staying live." Ethan's expression began to change. The anxiety that had haunted him since stepping on stage melted into a quiet, tearful smile. He signed, "Thank you." Keanu nodded and signed back, "Keep going." The crowd finally seemed to understand, not through words, but through the emotion radiating from the stage. For the first time that night, no one spoke, no one whispered, no one moved. Every eye in the studio was fixed on one moment of human connection that transcended sound. And in that silence, something extraordinary was born. Ethan's chest tightened as he realized the entire country might be laughing at his silence. But Keanu didn't flinch. He stood beside him, calm as still water, and raised his hands again. The movements were smooth, graceful, like he'd been waiting years for this exact moment. The audience fell into complete stillness. Keanu signed slowly, deliberately. "Your story matters." Ethan's eyes filled with tears. The lights above blurred, but his vision locked on Keanu's hands. For the first time, he felt seen. The crowd remained frozen, unable to look away. Every person in the studio could feel it. Something powerful was happening. Something that went beyond sound or fame. And as Keanu's final gesture ended in silence, a wave of awe swept through the room. No one clapped, no one spoke. The moment simply hung there, suspended in light and understanding. Then, as if breaking a long-held breath, a child in the audience began to clap. One by one, others joined not in mockery, but in reverence. The sound was hesitant at first, then grew into thunderous applause. Some stood, others wiped their eyes. The confusion that once filled the studio had transformed into pure emotion. Ethan covered his mouth, overwhelmed. He signed softly, "Thank you," though only Keanu understood. Keanu smiled, nodded, and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder before stepping back. The host finally found her voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her tone trembling, "I think we just witnessed the most powerful story ever told." Without a single word, the camera zoomed in on Ethan's tear-streaked face, then on Keanu's steady gaze. Two men, one silent, one speaking, had just changed the meaning of communication forever. The applause began to fade, but the air inside the studio stayed charged with emotion and confusion. The cameras never stopped rolling, sweeping across rows of faces frozen between amazement and uncertainty. The hosts stood at the edge of the stage, earpieces buzzing with voices from the control room. "Do we cut to commercial?" the director whispered urgently. His voice came through every headset in the studio, tense and uncertain. "What's happening out there?" The main host, a woman named Lana Torres, looked toward the judge's table. "He's not using a microphone," she whispered to her co-host. "Do we stop him?" Her partner, Derek Sloan, frowned and shook his head. "I don't know. Just let it roll. The audience seems invested." His tone betrayed his confusion. This was live television, and silence was the enemy of ratings. Yet somehow, the silence felt impossible to interrupt. On stage, Ethan Rivera stood still, unsure if he should continue. His hands twitched at his sides. He had rehearsed his story dozens of times in front of a mirror, every motion perfectly timed. But now, looking at the sea of puzzled faces, his confidence began to waver. He started signing again, slower this time, almost apologetic. His hands told the second part of his story, how his grandfather, unable to speak after an injury, had taught him that love could be expressed without sound. His gestures were soft, heartfelt, but they collided with the confusion in the room. A man in the audience leaned to his wife. "Is this performance art or something?" he whispered. She shrugged. A few people chuckled quietly. Others looked uncomfortable, not wanting to seem rude, but unsure how to respond. Then, from the third row, a small voice cut through the silence. A boy, no older than 7, tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, why isn't he talking?" The question carried through the air like an echo. The cameras caught it. The audience shifted. A few people looked down, suddenly aware of how little they understood about what they were watching. The judges exchanged glances. Rick Lawson leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the table. "I don't get it," he muttered under his breath. "This is a storytelling show. He's not telling anything." Maya Collins, sitting beside him, gave a sharp look. "Maybe he is," she whispered. "You're just not listening the right way." Rick's eyebrows furrowed, but he said nothing more. At the far end of the table sat Keanu Reeves, his posture calm and composed. He hadn't moved since the moment Ethan began. His eyes followed every motion of the young man's hands. To him, the story was clear. He could see it in the way Ethan's face changed with each emotion, the way his shoulders lifted when he signed words like hope and lowered when he signed loss. Keanu's memory drifted briefly. Years ago, while filming a small documentary project in Vancouver, he had volunteered at a children's hospital. Many of the kids there couldn't speak due to illness or injury. He remembered learning the basics of sign language so he could talk to them. He remembered the first time a little girl had smiled after he signed "thank you." That smile had said more than any word could. Now, standing here, he felt that same silent connection again. Ethan's hands were saying something deeply human, but most of the room was missing it. Keanu could hear the faint rustle of the audience growing louder, the nervous coughs, the murmurs, the restless shifting of feet. The magic of the moment was slipping away. In the control booth, the director finally snapped. "Cut to commercial in 5 seconds," he said. "We'll clean this up after." But before the countdown began, Keanu did something unexpected. He pushed his chair back quietly, the legs scraping against the floor, and stood. His tall frame drew every camera. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The assistant director shouted, "Stay seated! We're live!" Keanu didn't respond. He looked at Ethan on stage. The young man's eyes met his, full of uncertainty and embarrassment. Keanu took a slow breath and raised his right hand, not in greeting, not in command, but in calm recognition. The gesture was small, deliberate. The audience stopped murmuring. Every head turned toward him. Keanu's eyes softened. He understood the importance of the next few seconds. He had seen people humiliated before for being different, misunderstood, or unheard. He wasn't about to let that happen again. He took one step forward. The director's voice cracked through the headset. "Don't cut. Whatever this is, keep it rolling." And so the cameras stayed on, recording the quietest, most confusing, and most powerful moment the show had ever seen. The studio lights shimmered off Keanu's black blazer as he slowly walked toward the stage. Each footstep echoed in the silence. The hosts froze, unsure whether to stop him or step aside. For a few seconds, no one even breathed. Ethan's eyes widened, uncertain what was happening. His hands dropped to his sides as Keanu approached. Every camera followed the movement. Screens across America now filled with the image of the actor stepping into an unscripted moment that no one could explain. The crowd's murmuring grew again, mixed with gasps and nervous laughter. Some thought it was part of the show. Others felt something deeper, forming something real. Keanu paused at the bottom of the stairs leading to the stage. His gaze never left Ethan. Then he lifted his hand gently, the same way he had years ago when signing to sick children in hospital wards. The gesture said, "Wait." It wasn't commanding. It was respectful, patient. Ethan blinked, confused, then nodded. The audience, though they couldn't understand, sensed the meaning. The sound in the room vanished completely. Keanu turned to face the crowd. His expression was calm but firm, his voice low and steady when he finally spoke. "Let's listen," he said simply. The audience stilled. The control room fell silent. Even the flashing light on the camera stopped blinking as if holding its breath. Ethan, heart pounding, began signing again, slower, clearer this time. With every movement of his hands, Keanu watched intently, translating silently in his mind. The show was supposed to entertain, but something far more powerful was unfolding. In that moment, confusion gave way to understanding, even for those who didn't know the language. And Keanu, standing there between the crowd and the performer, became the bridge. In the control booth, the director leaned forward, his eyes glued to the monitors. "Keep rolling," he whispered. "Don't cut away. Something's happening." The producers exchanged nervous looks, but no one moved. Down on stage, Ethan signed with renewed emotion. The story flowed through his hands, his grandfather in a hospital bed, his mother holding back tears, his younger self learning that love didn't always need a voice. His eyes glistened as he signed the word hope. Though few in the room understood, they felt it. Every gesture carried a pulse, a rhythm that resonated beyond words. Even the skeptical judge, Rick, stopped fidgeting. He leaned forward slightly, unable to look away. In the audience, people who had once giggled now sat with hands folded, watching in awe. The boy who had asked why Ethan wasn't talking whispered to his mother again, this time softly, "I think he's telling us something." She nodded, her eyes damp. Keanu remained still, every part of his body attentive. For him, it wasn't performance anymore. It was connection. He could almost hear the silence breathing between gestures, a language of emotion older than speech itself. Ethan's final signs came like poetry, his hands drawing a circle in the air, then resting over his heart. When he finished, he looked toward Keanu again, unsure if he'd done enough. Keanu nodded slowly. The faintest smile touched his lips. The room didn't erupt into applause. Not yet. Instead, a stillness hung in the air. A reverent, fragile quiet that said more than any standing ovation ever could. And as the lights dimmed slightly for transition, the moment froze in memory, leaving millions of viewers across the nation speechless. In front of their screens, moments before Ethan stepped onto the stage, the backstage area buzzed with organized chaos. Technicians hurried between cables and lighting rigs, producers whispered through earpieces, and contestants waited nervously for their chance under the bright lights. The sound of laughter and applause from the previous act drifted through the curtain, filling the small hallway with the illusion of confidence. Ethan sat in a metal chair by the wall, his interpreter beside him. His hands fidgeted with the edge of his vest, fingers trembling. He couldn't hear the noise, but he could feel the vibration of excitement in the air, the rhythmic thud of footsteps, the faint hum of the crowd's energy. It pulsed through the floor and up into his bones like a heartbeat. A young producer crouched beside him, clipboard in hand. She smiled politely, but her tone carried hesitation. "Ethan," she said, speaking slowly, so his interpreter could sign the words clearly. "We just want to make sure you understand. This is a live broadcast. There won't be captions or translations in real time. Are you sure you want to perform in sign language only?" The interpreter relayed her words. Ethan watched, his dark eyes calm but resolute. He took a breath, then signed firmly, "Yes, this is my voice." The interpreter repeated his response aloud. The producer hesitated. "It's just that people might not get it. They might not understand what you're trying to say." Ethan smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both patience and pain. "That's okay," he signed. "They don't have to understand at first. They just have to feel it." The producer's expression softened, but she still looked uncertain. "All right, you'll be great out there." She patted his shoulder and moved on. Ethan sat quietly for a moment after she left. He could see his reflection in a dusty backstage mirror. His mother had ironed that blue vest the night before, reminding him, "You have a voice even when the world can't hear you." Those words played in his mind now. His interpreter, a kind man named Luis, leaned closer. "Are you nervous?" he asked. Ethan laughed silently and signed, "Always." "But not scared." Luis smiled. "Good. That's the difference between fear and courage." Ethan nodded. "My grandfather used to say that." The memory surfaced vividly, his grandfather sitting in a rocking chair on their small porch in Bakersfield, California. The old man's hands told stories better than any book could. He had fought in Vietnam, lost part of his hearing after an explosion, and learned to communicate with gestures long before Ethan was born. Ethan remembered sitting on the floor, watching those strong, wrinkled hands move through the air. Stories of brothers in arms, of long nights under the stars, of coming home to silence, but still finding peace. Every story ended with the same sign, two hands pressed over the heart. Gratitude. That was what Ethan planned to share tonight. Not a tragedy, not a plea for pity, just a story of perseverance passed down through generations. A stagehand appeared from behind the curtain and gestured for him to follow. Louise signed. "You're up." Ethan stood, adjusted his vest, and exhaled slowly. He walked toward the narrow opening where the light spilled through. Just before stepping into the glow, he turned to Louise and signed, "No matter what happens, thank you." Louise nodded, his eyes glassy with emotion. "Go make them see, Ethan." The moment Ethan stepped into the light, the energy changed. He could feel it even before the audience saw him. The air was heavier, the temperature warmer. The vibrations of movement, whispers, and electricity surrounded him. He couldn't hear the host introducing him, but he saw her smile, her lips forming his name. He took his place at the center of the stage. His hands rose, steady but graceful. He began to tell the story. At first, he signed small details: his grandfather's face, the sound of fireworks mistaken for gunfire, the loneliness of silence. Then he moved to broader gestures: hope, resilience, and gratitude. Every motion carried purpose. But as the camera zoomed closer, it caught something the audience didn't see from afar. Ethan's trembling fingers, the tiny shakes that betrayed his composure, the fear that his story would be lost in translation. He could sense something shifting beyond the lights. The air didn't move the same way anymore. He could feel laughter, confusion, a kind of restless impatience in the audience. He didn't need sound to know what misunderstanding felt like. Still, he didn't stop. He kept signing, his story of gratitude and perseverance flowing like water, steady and unstoppable. As Ethan continued signing under the hot lights, the world beyond the stage blurred into motionless faces. Every gesture carried his heart, yet their stillness pressed on him like a wall of doubt. He couldn't hear the murmurs, but he could feel the shift, the hesitation, the awkward energy that always followed silence in public places. He remembered the producer's words from earlier, echoing inside his head like ghosts. They might not get it. The fear he had buried deep began to stir again. What if they thought he was mocking the show? What if they laughed? His hands slowed, faltering for a moment. But then another memory rose: his mother sitting at their kitchen table, tracing signs into the air as she practiced the alphabet after long shifts at the diner. Her hands had been rough, blistered, but patient. She never gave up trying to speak his language. He saw her face in his mind, the way she would smile and sign. Never let them tell you silence isn't strength. Ethan straightened his shoulders and took a breath. The sweat on his forehead caught the light, glimmering like glass. He raised his hands again, continuing the story. His fingers painted scenes of loss, then hope, then deep, unwavering gratitude. In the audience, Keanu's gaze never left him. He could see the pain and pride woven into each movement. The camera zoomed in on Ethan's trembling hands, catching every detail: the pulse in his wrist, the flicker of emotion in his eyes. Keanu knew the audience didn't yet understand what they were witnessing, but he did. He leaned forward slightly, sensing the need to act soon. Something inside him whispered that this moment could not be left to fade in confusion. Backstage, Luis watched from the monitor, his heart pounding. He could read every motion of Ethan's story, every flicker of emotion that passed through his hands. He wanted to yell at the world beyond the glass, to tell them to open their eyes to truly see. But all he could do was hope that someone out there would understand. On stage, Ethan's movements grew stronger again, like waves gathering momentum. He signed the moment his grandfather taught him that hands could hold stories, not just words. He signed the day. His mother cried when he got his first hearing aid, and how he refused to wear it because he didn't want to hear noise, he wanted to hear meaning. His hands moved faster, tears building in his eyes. But in the front rows, the crowd still didn't grasp the beauty in front of them. Some leaned back, unsure what to do. Others whispered questions, their voices barely audible but sharp enough to cut the air. That was when Keanu sat up straighter. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus. He had seen this before, the look of someone misunderstood, simply because they spoke differently. The sound of quiet judgment was louder than applause. He remembered a boy he met at a rehab center years ago, a child who spoke only through signs and drawings. Keanu had promised himself that if he ever saw that same struggle again, he wouldn't stay silent. Now, sitting there, he knew this was that moment. Ethan's story wasn't just performance, it was survival. And if the world wouldn't listen with its ears, Keanu would make sure it listened with its heart. The air inside the studio was thick with uncertainty. For a long moment, no one moved. Every camera was trained on Keanu Reeves as he rose from his chair and began to walk toward the stage. The audience watched in uneasy silence, unsure whether this was part of the show or a shocking interruption. Lana Torres, the host, froze near the teleprompter. Her earpiece buzzed with frantic voices from the control room. "Is this planned? What's he doing?" the director's voice hissed. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The moment was unfolding beyond the script, and instinct told her not to interfere. On stage, Ethan Rivera's movements slowed as he saw Keanu approaching. His breath caught in his chest. For a split second, he feared he was about to be escorted off, that maybe his act had confused or frustrated the audience too much. His eyes darted to the judge's table, searching for understanding. But what he found instead was calm recognition. Keanu stepped up onto the platform, his black shoes glinting under the stage lights. He didn't rush. He didn't wave for attention. The quiet authority in his presence commanded it naturally. When he reached Ethan, he paused, letting the energy of the moment settle. Before acting, the camera zoomed in. 100 million viewers across America held their breath. Keanu lifted his hand slowly and placed it on Ethan's shoulder, a gesture so small, yet so full of assurance, that the entire crowd seemed to exhale at once. Ethan's eyes widened in disbelief. He could read Keanu's expression before a single sign was made: understanding, empathy, and encouragement. Keanu's fingers began to move in the air with gentle precision. His hand shaped the signs, clearly simple phrases, steady rhythm. "You're doing great," he signed first. Then, with a quiet smile, he added, "I understand." Ethan's lips parted in shock. He blinked hard, emotion flooding his face like a sudden tide. His hands trembled as he signed back. "You know how to sign?" Keanu nodded once. He didn't speak yet. He just kept signing, I learned. I wanted to listen. The studio audience had gone completely still. The producers in the control room whispered, "Oh my God, he knows sign language?" It was no longer a performance. It was a bridge, being built in real time, one silent gesture at a time. Keanu turned his head slightly, scanning the audience, his calm voice finally breaking the silence. "He's not just performing," he said softly, each word measured. "He's telling a story about courage, about his grandfather who never gave up just like him." A ripple of emotion moved through the crowd. People leaned forward, faces softening, tears forming in eyes that had once been skeptical. The judges watched, stunned, as the atmosphere transformed from confusion to reverence. Ethan's breathing steadied. The fear that had shadowed him since the curtain rose began to fade. Standing beside Keanu, he felt an anchor, someone who not only understood his language, but believed in his story. Keanu lifted his hands again and signed with him, matching his rhythm perfectly. Two sets of hands moved in unison under the blazing studio lights, one known for his movies, the other for his silence. Yet in that moment, they spoke the same language. The silence that followed was not empty. It was sacred. From the control room, the director pressed his palms to his temples. "Keep the cameras rolling," he muttered. "Don't cut away. This is gold." But even as he said it, he knew this wasn't about ratings anymore. Something rare was unfolding, something no script could have written. On stage, Keanu turned fully toward Ethan, hands still moving with steady rhythm. His signs were not polished like a professional interpreter's, but they were fluent enough to carry meaning. His eyes did the rest clear, compassionate, unwavering. "You're not alone," he signed. "They'll understand now." Ethan's throat tightened. For years, he had dreamed of being understood, not as a novelty or a symbol, but as a storyteller. He blinked hard, the stage lights reflecting off his tears. His trembling hands began to move again. Keanu mirrored him, interpreting the motions aloud for the audience. "He's saying," Keanu spoke softly, "that his grandfather came home from war unable to speak, that he learned to tell stories through his hands." The words echoed through the hall. The crowd, once restless, sat transfixed. You could hear the faint creak of seats as people leaned forward, hungry for every word. Ethan continued, his gestures growing more expressive, and Keanu followed along, his voice threading through the silence like a bridge between two worlds. "He's saying that every gesture carries a memory," Keanu translated, his voice breaking slightly. "That love is something you see, not something you hear." A woman in the audience began to cry quietly. The boy who had earlier asked why Ethan wasn't talking now sat on his mother's lap, eyes wide, hands clasped in awe. The energy in the room shifted again, not confusion now, but connection. Ethan's hands slowed. His story reached its final message. He pressed his palms together and drew them toward his chest, then opened them outward, releasing the invisible weight of his grandfather's story into the air. Keanu understood. He stepped closer and signed the final words with him, saying aloud, "Gratitude is louder than words." The line hung in the air like music without sound. For a few long seconds, no one moved. Every light in the studio seemed softer now, the edges of the moment glowing with quiet reverence. Even the hum of equipment faded into stillness. Then, slowly, Keanu turned back to Ethan. He didn't bow, didn't gesture for applause. He simply smiled and signed again, "Thank you for sharing him with us." Ethan covered his mouth, shaking with emotion. For the first time in his life, silence felt celebrated. The stage that had once felt isolating now felt like home. In the front rows, judges rose to their feet. The audience followed, clapping cautiously at first, then louder, then all at once, an eruption of feeling that filled the entire theater. Ethan looked out into the crowd, overwhelmed. His tears blurred the faces, but he could still make out the movement of hands, dozens of people in the audience signing thank you back to him, imperfectly but earnestly. Keanu stepped back, his expression peaceful, as though he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. The applause rolled through the studio like a wave, but it didn't sound like the usual roar of a live audience. It was softer, steadier, filled with awe instead of noise. Ethan stood frozen, tears streaking his cheeks, while Keanu gently guided him to face the crowd. Every light shimmered off the comment, stage floor, and the cameras captured something that felt larger than television. It felt like history. The host wiped her eyes, her microphone trembling in her hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said softly, "this is why we tell stories. To remind us that every voice, spoken or not, matters." In the control booth, no one spoke. The director just sat there, staring at the monitor, his hand over his mouth. "Keep this feed," he whispered. "Don't fade out." Ethan turned toward Keanu again. He signed slowly. "I thought no one would understand." Keanu smiled, his face warm beneath the lights. "They do now," he signed back. "You gave them a gift. Ethan shook his head, still in disbelief. "You did this. You made them listen." Keanu raised a hand slightly. "No," he signed. "You made them feel." Then he added aloud for the audience. He didn't need to speak to move us. He just needed to be brave enough to stand here. The audience's applause swelled again, this time joined by something extraordinary. Hundreds of viewers at home, watching live, began signing along as well. On social media, clips spread instantly. Keanu Reeves signs for the deaf became a trending headline within minutes. Back on stage, Ethan's body shook with emotion. He pressed his hands to his heart, signing one last message to Keanu. "You gave me my voice tonight." Keanu's eyes glistened. He didn't respond with words. He just placed his hand over Ethan's and nodded, a silent promise of solidarity. The moment stretched on a breath held by millions. The producers finally let the silence linger before cutting to the closing shot. The camera panned slowly across the crowd, capturing tears, smiles, and the subtle beauty of dozens of people now mimicking simple signs they just learned. When the final spotlight dimmed, Keanu stepped off the stage quietly, not seeking attention or credit. Behind him, Ethan stood alone for a moment, looking out at the audience that had once doubted him. This time, they were all listening not with their ears, but with their hearts. As the credits rolled later that night, one phrase appeared across the screen in both text and sign language. "Sometimes, silence says everything." It would be replayed in schools, on talk shows, and in living rooms across the country. But for Ethan and Keanu, it wasn't about virality or fame. It was about connection, the kind that could only be born when one person decided to step forward. The crowd had quieted completely. Every camera, every spotlight, every heartbeat in that studio seemed to align toward one thing: Ethan's story. Keanu stood beside him, the steady interpreter of a truth too deep for words. When Ethan began signing again, the room felt sacred. Ethan's hands moved carefully, forming shapes that carried memory. Keanu watched him closely, eyes following each gesture. Then, with calm precision, Keanu translated aloud. "He's telling us about his grandfather," he said softly. "A soldier who came home from war but couldn't speak after an injury." The audience held its breath. Ethan's hands mimed the explosion, the fall, the long hospital nights. He signed how his grandfather woke each morning in silence, unable to call out to his family, but always smiling. His gestures slowed as he portrayed the way his grandfather would trace letters into the air or tap his chest twice to say, "I love you." Keanu's voice carried the story gently across the store's room. He says his grandfather taught him that love doesn't need sound, it needs presence. That words can fade, but gestures last forever. A tear rolled down the cheek of one of the judges. Another clasped her hands together tightly. The audience didn't dare move. Ethan's hands shifted again, this time faster, more emotional. His story leapt years ahead to his own childhood. He signed how he grew up feeling trapped between two worlds, one full of sound that he couldn't reach, and one full of silence that others refused to enter. He showed how teachers turned away when he tried to communicate, how classmates mocked him by pretending to sign nonsense. Keanu translated faithfully, but his voice softened as the words came out. He says he learned to listen with his eyes, to see emotion where others only saw noise. As Ethan signed, his face changed pain, giving way to pride. He described how he began to tell stories through his hands, just as his grandfather once did. He signed how, as a child, he would perform small tales for his mother, acting out entire scenes silently while she watched and smiled through tears. Keanu translated, his tone reverent. He says his mother worked long hours, but she always came home and sat at the kitchen table to watch his stories. She told him that silence could be beautiful too. The audience shifted, eyes glistening. Somewhere in the middle rows, a woman dabbed her face with a tissue. Ethan's fingers paused for a heartbeat, then began again, trembling slightly as he signed his next memory, his grandfather's funeral. He described the silence of that day. No speeches, no music, just the rustle of wind through the trees and a few hands raised in quiet farewell. Ethan had signed a promise over the coffin, a vow to tell his grandfather's story someday so the world would understand that silence was not absence. It was another form of strength. Keanu's voice carried that vow aloud, clear and slow, promised his grandfather he would share his language with the world, that he would prove silence can move mountains. The audience remained silent. The camera zoomed in on Ethan's face, his eyes shining with emotion, his lips trembling as though holding back a sob. And when he stopped signing, Keanu looked at him, nodded, and raised his hands again, ready to help him continue the story. Ethan took another deep breath. As his story reached the turning point, his hands rose again, slower this time, trembling with emotion. The movement of his fingers traced invisible threads of memory, childhood moments with his grandfather, the soft lessons learned in silence. Keanu stood just beside him, his eyes following every motion with focus and empathy. When Ethan signed the next part, Keanu translated aloud, his voice calm but charged with feeling. He says that when he was a boy, his grandfather taught him to tell stories using nothing but his hands and his heart. He says that through one, silence, they spoke more honestly than most people ever do. The studio lights dimmed slightly, isolating the two men in a soft pool of light. The world outside the stage faded. For the audience, it was as if time had stopped. Ethan signed again, his movements deliberate and flowing. He says, Keanu continued, that when people stopped listening to him, he began to watch them instead. He learned that kindness shows in the eyes, not in the voice. He learned that grief can speak through stillness. Ethan signed faster now, passion replacing fear. His gestures told of growing older, of the frustration of being misunderstood in a world that loved sound more than silence. He signed about trying to share stories in classrooms and open mics, only to see people lose interest after the first few seconds. Keanu's voice grew softer as he translated. He says he never stopped believing that stories could be told by anyone. He just needed someone to stand beside him long enough to help the world see what he was saying. Those words landed like a stone, dropped into water, sending ripples through the audience. The boy in the front row, the one who had asked why Ethan wasn't speaking, whispered to his mother. He just wanted someone to listen. She nodded, holding him close. Ethan slowed again, tears glistening under the lights. He signed, I wanted to teach children like me to show them that silence isn't emptiness, it's expression. Keanu felt the weight of those words. He translated, voice breaking just slightly. He dreams of teaching deaf children how to tell stories, not just with words, but with every part of who they are. The studio audience sat frozen, and even the judges leaned forward as if afraid to miss a single syllable. The message was simple, but it carried the force of something timeless. Ethan lifted his hands for the closing gesture of his story. He shaped the sign for gratitude, pressing his fingers to his lips and then outward into the air. Keanu knew the moment well. He had seen that gesture before when volunteering years ago. It meant, thank you, but more than that, it meant, I give this to you. Keanu's voice carried the final words across the hall. He says, gratitude is louder than words. The audience gasped softly, and the silence that followed was unlike any before. It wasn't confusion now. It was reverence. For a long moment, no one dared to move. The lights above cast a warm glow over Ethan and Keanu, the two figures standing side by side in silence that no longer felt empty. It felt alive. The sound of breathing, of quiet tears, of hearts breaking open filled the studio. Ethan's hands lowered slowly. His story was finished. The tension that had built inside him since the first moment he stepped onto that stage released in one trembling exhale. Keanu turned toward him, smiling gently. With calm reverence, he lifted his hands and signed Ethan's last message again, making sure every viewer, in that studio and at home, could feel its meaning. Gratitude is louder than words. He didn't just speak it. He signed it deliberately, gracefully, each movement a bridge between worlds. When his final gesture lingered in the air, the audience rose to their feet. The applause that followed wasn't the usual roar of a crowd. It was a wave of emotion that carried awe, humility, and deep respect. Cameras zoomed in as tears rolled freely down faces across the studio. The judges stood as one, hands pressed together in admiration. Even the director in the control booth wiped his eyes. For years, the show had celebrated dramatic stories, but none had ever silenced a crowd so completely. Keanu turned back toward Ethan, placing a hand over his shoulder. Ethan looked up, his eyes glistening with disbelief and joy. He signed softly, "Thank you for hearing me." Keanu responded in the same language, "You helped the world listen." A single spotlight remained on them as the applause faded. The rest of the stage dimmed into darkness, leaving only two men, one who had spoken without sound, and one who had listened without words. It was more than performance. It was a lesson the world would not forget. The next morning, the world woke to silence, but not the kind Ethan had known all his life. This silence was reverent, the kind that followed awe. Overnight, the clip from America's Got Story had gone viral. Across every platform, one title dominated feeds: Keanu Reeves, Signs for the Deaf. The video showed the moment when Keanu walked onto the stage, placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder, and began to sign. It lasted less than 3 minutes, yet it changed the tone of an entire nation's conversation. In the first few hours, it was shared millions of times. Comments poured in from teachers, veterans, and families of the hearing impaired. The caption under one of the most watched uploads read, "For the first time, silence spoke louder than applause." Ethan didn't even know about it at first. When he woke up in his small apartment the following morning, his phone was flooded with messages, hundreds of them. His mother had called 17 times. His interpreter, Luis, had texted in all caps, "Turn on the news right now." Ethan sat up, still groggy, and reached for the remote. When the screen flickered on, every major news channel showed the same clip. The anchors spoke with wonder. What began as confusion on live television turned into a moment of unity that is now being called the speechless speech that moved a nation. As the footage replayed, Ethan covered his mouth. Seeing himself on screen, standing next to Keanu under the soft light, felt surreal. He hadn't realized how powerful the moment looked from the outside. The captioning at the bottom read, "Gratitude is louder than words." His mother's face appeared on a small video call notification. He answered immediately. Rosa Rivera's eyes were red from crying, her voice trembling with pride as Luis interpreted her words through the call. "You did it, mijo. You made them understand." Ethan smiled through tears. "We did," he signed. "He helped me show them." Meanwhile, Keanu was still asleep at his modest home in the Hollywood Hills. His phone buzzed nonstop. Publicists, journalists, old friends. Every outlet wanted an exclusive interview. His assistant left 10 voicemails. "Good Morning America wants you. CNN, BBC, everyone's calling." But when Keanu finally stirred and saw the headlines, he didn't smile at the fame or the praise. He watched the clip in silence, the faintest smile touching his lips. Not because of what he'd done, but because of what it meant. He whispered to himself, "It wasn't my story. It was Ethan's." Then he turned off his phone. By mid-morning, hashtags flooded the internet. Number learn to listen. Number gratitude is louder. Number Keanu signs. Deaf communities across America celebrated online, sharing stories of finally feeling seen. Parents posted videos of their children signing thank you to the camera. One comment under the trending post read, "For the first time, my daughter asked to learn sign language because she said Keanu understands her world." At universities and workplaces, conversations shifted. People who had never thought about accessibility began searching for local sign language classes. The National Interpreter Registry reported a 300% increase in web traffic overnight. One reporter called it the quietest revolution in modern media. And it all started with one man choosing to listen differently. Within 48 hours, the clip became the most viewed video in the country. Major talk shows replayed it with captions, breaking down every gesture and expression. A segment on Today called it a masterclass in humanity. The clip of Keanu signing, "You're doing great, I understand," became a symbol of compassion. Replayed thousands of times across social feeds. Comment sections filled with emotional stories. A woman from Ohio wrote, "My brother hasn't spoken in 10 years. Last night he watched this and signed to me for the first time. He said thank you." Another comment read, "I was embarrassed of my hearing aids growing up. Now I'm proud." The internet, for once, wasn't divided. It was united in admiration. Meanwhile, Keanu quietly avoided the spotlight. His assistant, Mark, arrived at his home carrying a stack of interview requests. "Everyone wants a statement," he said, setting the pile on the table. "The late-night shows, news anchors, even a few charities want to name programs after you." Keanu leaned back in his chair, sipping coffee. "I'll pass," he said simply. "It wasn't about me." Mark sighed. "But Keanu, this could inspire even more people if you..." Keanu shook his head. "They're already inspired. They don't need my face. They need his story." When the segment aired on Entertainment Weekly, the host mentioned that Keanu had declined all interviews, responding only through a single written statement. "The world doesn't need me to speak about kindness. It needs to practice it." That line alone went viral again. Ethan, meanwhile, was overwhelmed. Reporters waited outside his apartment complex. Offers poured in from book deals to talk show invitations. But he turned them all down. He didn't want to be a celebrity. He wanted to teach. With Luis's help, he started live streaming short lessons online. Simple, free tutorials on basic sign language and emotional expression. The first video reached 500,000 views in one day. In the comments, people began tagging schools and universities, asking them to bring Ethan in for workshops. Soon, teachers were incorporating his lessons into classrooms. Children signed their first words on camera. "Thank you, understand, love." The network that aired America's Got Story realized the magnitude of what had happened. They released a follow-up statement announcing that all future broadcasts would include live closed captions and interpreter support. "We learned something from Ethan and Keanu," the statement read. "Sometimes the best story is the one told without words." That week, public libraries across the country saw an unprecedented spike in requests for books about American Sign Language. Sign language classes filled up within days, leaving waiting lists several months long. Even in small towns, community centers began holding free Silent Nights events where people spent an evening communicating without speech. News outlets covered it, calling it the Keanu effect. But for Keanu, it wasn't about any of that. One evening, as the sun set over Los Angeles, he drove quietly through downtown and passed a billboard showing a still image from the show, him and Ethan standing under the spotlight. The caption beneath it read, "Gratitude is louder than words." He smiled faintly and whispered, "Yeah, it is." By the end of the week, the quiet act of understanding had become a nationwide movement. Television hosts signed short greetings on air. Musicians released songs titled "Gratitude is Louder." News anchors opened their broadcasts by signing "Good Evening." What began as a small, unplanned moment on stage had turned into a social shift. Ethan couldn't walk down the street without someone stopping to thank him. But it wasn't fame he felt, it was responsibility. Every handshake, every hug from a parent of a deaf child reminded him why he had gone on that stage in the first place. He wasn't looking for applause. He was looking for connection. Now the world finally wanted to listen. He partnered with Luis to start an initiative called Hands That Speak, a program offering free sign language workshops for schools and youth centers. Keanu quietly donated the first major grant, asking that his name not appear anywhere. When reporters pressed for confirmation, he declined to comment, saying only, "The story already belongs to everyone who heard it." Across the country, classrooms began practicing sign language during morning announcements. Teachers described the lessons as moments of empathy. Churches and community halls projected subtitles during sermons and meetings. What once felt like a niche skill became a symbol of compassion. On social media, Ethan's original video passed 100 million views. Underneath it, a comment from a teenage girl captured what the world was feeling. "He didn't make us hear silence, he made us feel it." Meanwhile, Keanu stayed true to his word. He avoided interviews and red carpets, spending his evenings volunteering at a local school for the hearing impaired. The children there didn't care about his fame. They simply loved that he signed with them, laughed with them, and listened without needing to say a thing. The nation called it a viral moment, but for Keanu and Ethan, it wasn't a moment at all. It was the beginning of something quieter and infinitely more lasting. Long before the night that changed everything, before the cameras and the lights, there was a small house on the quiet outskirts of Bakersfield, California. It sat at the end of a dusty street lined with lemon trees, their scent drifting through open windows on hot summer nights. That house belonged to the Riveras, a mother and her only child, Ethan. Ethan had been born deaf. Doctors said the nerves in his inner ear were too damaged to ever allow sound. His mother, Rosa Rivera, was 21 at the time, barely scraping by as a waitress at a roadside diner. When she held her newborn son, she remembered the silence of the hospital room, not tragic, not frightening, just still. She whispered, "You're my quiet miracle," though she knew he would never hear it. As Ethan grew, Rosa learned to read his emotions instead of his words. She knew the difference between his curious stare and his hungry one, between the way his brow furrowed in confusion and the way his eyes danced when he understood. Still, as he reached school age, the world outside their small home wasn't as patient. Elementary school was a battlefield of misunderstandings. Teachers tried to communicate by shouting slowly, as though loudness could bridge silence. Classmates mimicked his gestures, thinking it was a joke. During recess, he often sat alone, tracing patterns in the dirt while other children shouted across the playground. One afternoon, he came home crying, his small hands shaking. Rosa crouched beside him, wiping his tears. Through his tears, he signed, "They laughed because I don't talk." Rosa felt a sharp pain deep in her chest. She wanted to fight for him, to demand the world to listen. But she was just one woman, working double shifts, barely holding their lives together. That night, when Ethan had gone to sleep, she made herself a promise. She opened her old laptop and searched how to learn sign language. The videos loaded slowly, buffering through the static hum of their cheap internet. But she stayed up all night, repeating the movements with her hands, whispering the shapes of the letters even though no one could hear. Every night after that, she practiced while folding laundry, cooking dinner, and scrubbing dishes. She practiced until her hands cramped, until the letters felt like prayers. Weeks later, she sat across from her son at the kitchen table. The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, lighting her tired face. She signed her first sentence to him, "I love you, Ethan." He froze, eyes wide, then smiled so big it filled the whole room. He signed back, "You learned my words." Rosa nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. There are words now. From that day forward, the two of them built their world in silence, one sign at a time. At the diner, Rosa would sketch new symbols on napkins during breaks, bringing them home to practice. At school, Ethan began to teach his teachers simple signs, his way of creating tiny bridges in a world full of walls. Yet, even as the years passed, Ethan still felt the ache of being unseen. It wasn't the lack of sound that hurt it, it was the lack of understanding. Then, when he was 12 years old, something happened that changed his life forever. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the Bakersfield sun poured through the cracked blinds of their living room. Rosa was at work, and Ethan sat on the old couch, flipping through TV channels, reading the closed captions on the screen. Most shows bored him. The captions never kept up, and the emotions behind the words always got lost somewhere between sentences. Then he stumbled upon a rerun of a celebrity charity event, one that had aired years earlier but was being replayed on a local network. The screen showed a children's hospital, rows of smiling kids in hospital beds surrounded by actors and volunteers. The caption read, "Hollywood star visits hospital to bring joy." Ethan almost switched the channel until the camera focused on a man, sitting beside a little girl with a shaved head and bright eyes. The caption identified him as Keanu Reeves. Ethan recognized him vaguely from movies. But what caught his attention wasn't his face, it was his hands. The little girl was deaf. Ethan could tell by the way she touched her heart before speaking. And Keanu, sitting beside her, wasn't just nodding politely. He was signing. Slowly, carefully, not perfectly, but from the heart. Ethan leaned closer to the screen, eyes wide. The captions appeared. "You're brave," Keanu signed. "You're strong." The girl smiled weakly and signed back. "Thank you for learning." Ethan felt something stir deep inside him. Until that moment, he had never seen someone famous speak in his language. People like him were often ignored, silenced, or pitied. But here was a man from another world, wealthy, famous, loved by millions, taking the time to learn words he didn't need to use. When Rosa came home that evening, Ethan ran to her, signing rapidly. She barely had time to set down her purse. "Mom! Mom! The man from the movies! He talks with his hands!" She smiled, confused. "What man?" He pointed at the TV, replaying the scene. "Him. He's like me." Rosa sat beside him, watching the replay in silence. Keanu was still on screen, holding the little girl's hand as he signed "You Matter." Rosa felt her throat tighten. She looked at her son, his face glowing with hope, and whispered softly, "Maybe kindness doesn't need sound either." That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above him, imagining a world where everyone spoke with their hearts instead of their voices. He thought about Keanu's calm face, the warmth in his eyes. For the first time, he believed that his silence wasn't a curse, it was a kind of strength. He began to dream differently after that. While other kids talked about being singers or astronauts, Ethan started signing stories in front of the mirror. He performed them for his mother, creating whole worlds with his hands. He told stories about bravery, forgiveness, and gratitude. Rosa encouraged him constantly. "One day, mijo," she said, signing and speaking at once. "You'll tell your story to the world, and they'll listen. I promise." He didn't know when or how, but he believed her. Years passed. Ethan grew into a young man who carried silence like armor and compassion like a flame. He studied body language, emotion, and human expression with the same dedication others gave to speech. And through every struggle, every lonely moment, one image stayed with him. The actor who had once signed, "You're brave." By the time Ethan reached his late 20s, life had carved him into someone both gentle and unbreakable. He worked part-time at a community center, teaching sign language to children, most of whom were hearing. He wanted them to know what it felt like to truly see someone. Each lesson ended the same way, with the words, "Thank you," signed slowly, hands open, eyes lifted. Yet even as he taught others to listen through silence, he couldn't silence one thought, the dream he'd carried since he was 12, the dream of meeting the man who had unknowingly changed his life. Keanu Reeves was still a distant figure, an untouchable star. But the memory of that hospital video remained like a compass in Ethan's heart. When America's Got Story announced auditions for storytellers from all walks of life, Ethan hesitated. He knew it was risky. He knew people might not understand. But he also knew some stories are meant to be told, even if no one can hear them. He signed up the next morning. On the day of his audition, Rosa hugged him tight, her hands trembling. "Whatever happens," she signed, "remember that your story already matters." Ethan nodded, smiling through his nerves. "I'm ready, Mom." He stepped onto that stage, believing he was alone, unaware that destiny had been quietly waiting for years, ready to bring him face to face with the man who had once told a little girl, "You're brave." And as the lights shone down and his hands began to move, fate completed the circle. Keanu was there, not as an actor, not as a symbol, but as the listener Ethan had been searching for all his life. That night, long after the applause faded and the studio lights dimmed, Keanu Reeves drove home through the quiet streets of Los Angeles. The city buzzed faintly in the distance, but his mind was still caught in the silence of that stage. Even with the windows down, the cool air brushing his face, he could still see Ethan's trembling hands, still feel the weight of that moment when understanding replaced noise. When he pulled into his driveway, the night was calm. He didn't rush inside. Instead, he sat in the car for a few minutes, his hands resting loosely on the steering wheel, replaying everything that had happened. It wasn't the applause that stayed with him. It was the look on Ethan's face when he realized someone finally understood him. That look of shock, then gratitude. Keanu had spent decades surrounded by cameras and sound stages, but he couldn't remember the last time silence had felt so alive. That studio, that crowd, it had all disappeared the instant he signed those words. For a few moments, there had been no fame, no roles, no barriers, just human connection. He finally stepped out of the car and walked up the small path to his porch. The night air carried the faint scent of jasmine. Above him, the stars glittered faintly through the haze. He sat down in his favorite wooden chair, one he'd owned since his early acting days in Vancouver. It creaked beneath his weight, just like it used to back then, when he'd come home exhausted from long days on set. He remembered that city, well, Vancouver, the place where his understanding of silence had first begun. Back in the early 1990 seconds, between film projects, he had volunteered at a small school for hearing-impaired children. He hadn't planned to learn sign language. He'd simply shown up one day to read stories to the kids, thinking his voice might comfort them. But when he realized they couldn't hear him, something in him shifted. The teacher at the time, an older woman named Mrs. Han, had smiled and said, "You can still speak to them, Keanu. You just need to use your hands." He'd stayed after class for weeks, practicing slowly, one word at a time. The children had laughed when he made mistakes, but they'd helped him learn. He remembered one boy in particular, maybe 8 years old, who taught him how to sign friend. They'd use that sign every day after. Keanu smiled faintly at the memory, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the same gesture into the air. He hadn't thought about that school in years. He'd assumed those small lessons had been forgotten, lost to time and busy schedules. Yet tonight, in front of millions, they had found their way back to him. He looked up at the stars again, feeling a deep stillness inside him. It amazed him how moments from long ago could ripple through time, returning when they were needed most. What began as a small act of kindness had become something much larger, something that connected him to a man he'd never met until that day. Inside the house, his old notebook sat on a shelf near the door, a charity log he'd been keeping for years. It wasn't something he showed anyone. It wasn't for publicity or record keeping. It was simply a reminder to himself of what mattered. He went inside, turned on a dim light, and opened the notebook to the newest blank page. The pages were filled with notes about past events, hospital visits, scholarships, community grants. But tonight, his hand hovered for a long time before writing anything. Finally, in neat, deliberate handwriting, he wrote a single line. "Sometimes, silence speaks the truth." He closed the notebook gently, resting his hand on its cover for a moment before setting it aside. The clock ticked softly in the background as Keanu leaned back in his chair, his thoughts still wrapped around the events of the day. He had spent a lifetime surrounded by dialogue, scripts, and sound. Yet somehow, the quiet between gestures tonight had said more than any speech ever could. He poured himself a cup of tea and stepped back outside onto the porch. The moonlight fell across the yard, painting everything in pale silver. For a long while, he said nothing. He just sat there, listening to the faint hum of the night, the whisper of the breeze through the trees, the distant hum of traffic, the soft rhythm of his own breathing. He thought about Ethan, about the courage it must have taken to walk onto that stage knowing that people might not understand him. That kind of bravery didn't come from ambition or pride. It came from purpose. Ethan hadn't stepped into the spotlight for fame. He had done it to share something pure, something that couldn't be measured by applause. Keanu smiled faintly. It reminded him of the reason he'd started volunteering years ago, the reason he still believed in the power of small gestures. He had seen too many people chase attention and noise, mistaking it for meaning. Tonight had reminded him that real change often begins quietly, in places where no one's watching. His phone buzzed softly on the table beside him. For a moment, he thought it was another reporter, another request for comment. But when he picked it up, the name on the screen stopped him. It was a message from Rosa Rivera, Ethan's mother. The message was simple. "Thank you for seeing my son. You gave him back the voice I prayed the world would hear." Keanu stared at the words for a long moment, feeling a warmth rise in his chest. Then he typed a reply, short and sincere. He already had his voice. The world just needed to listen. He set the phone down and looked out over the city again. The lights shimmered like constellations below, and somewhere among them, Ethan and his mother were probably celebrating quietly, just as he was. Keanu lifted his tea to his lips and whispered softly into the night, "No need to thank me." The stars seemed to shimmer brighter, as if answering him, and in the stillness that followed, the world felt perfectly, beautifully silent. The week after the show aired, the world seemed to move slower, as though everyone had collectively paused to think. The headlines hadn't faded. They had multiplied. News anchors replayed the clip with tearful commentary. Talk show hosts opened their programs not with jokes, but with sincerity. One popular host called it the rebirth of compassion in entertainment. Another said, it wasn't about celebrity, it was about connection. Across social media, reactions poured in by the millions. Hashtags like #Keanu signs and #learn to listen continued trending. Some videos showed people attempting to mimic simple phrases in sign language. Families gathered around their dinner tables to discuss the story. For the first time in years, a viral moment wasn't about scandal or gossip. It was about kindness. Of course, there were skeptics too. Some online critics suggested the moment had been staged for publicity. Commentators debated whether the producers had orchestrated it to boost ratings. But for every doubt raised, there were hundreds of heartfelt responses defending the authenticity of what they had seen. One viral comment captured the world's sentiment perfectly. You can't script sincerity. You can't fake the way silence feels when it's filled with understanding. Keanu didn't address the controversy. He stayed completely silent on social media. No statements, no interviews, no photos. Instead, his quiet actions spoke for him. Through an anonymous donation later discovered by a journalist, he contributed a large sum to the American Deaf Children's Fund, listing it in Ethan's name, not his own. When reporters tried to confirm the story, the organization released a simple statement We received a generous gift dedicated to supporting young storytellers in the deaf community. The donor asked for no credit. We will honor that. The story spread quickly, and people admired him even more for it. One morning show host said it best. In a world that shouts for attention, Keanu Reeves keeps changing lives by whispering. Meanwhile, classrooms across America began using the now famous video as part of their curriculum. Teachers replayed the scene where Keanu signed, "You're doing great. I understand," encouraging students to learn the gesture themselves. Schools in New York, Texas, and California introduced short sign language segments during morning announcements. In a small elementary school in Denver, a teacher named Mrs. Collins stood before her fourth-grade class, teaching the sign for thank you. When she asked who wanted to volunteer, nearly every hand shot up. One boy, a shy student with a mild hearing disability, stepped forward and performed the gesture perfectly. The class applauded not loudly, but with fluttering hands, the deaf applause they had learned from the clip. Later that day, Mrs. Collins received an email from a parent. It read, "My son came home signing thank you," he said. "He wants to learn more so he can talk to his classmate. Thank you for showing them that understanding doesn't always need sound." Everywhere, small stories like that multiplied. Communities began hosting free silent nights where people practiced communicating without words. Libraries organized book readings on sign language and empathy. Local news outlets called it the Keanu Ripple. And somewhere in all that change, Keanu stayed invisible, still volunteering quietly, still choosing presence over publicity. He knew the moment wasn't his to own. It belonged to something much greater. By the second week, the moment had spread far beyond the United States. International news outlets picked up the story, translating headlines into dozens of languages. In Japan, a newspaper called it the language of the heart. In France, a talk show host described it as the miracle of listening without sound. And in Mexico, families shared clips with pride, knowing Ethan's roots traced back to their own heritage. Online, the effect was profound. Millions of people began sharing videos of themselves, signing simple words: thank you, love, courage. On TikTok, one trend challenged people to spend an hour communicating only with gestures, learning empathy in silence. In the comments, a user wrote, "I never realized how much I take speech for granted until I had to speak with my hands." Ethan watched it all from his small apartment in Bakersfield. He couldn't hear the voices of praise, but he could see the change. Every time he opened his phone, new notifications appeared. Students sharing class projects, parents thanking him, people recording themselves, learning the alphabet in sign language. Some wrote long messages describing how they'd reconnected with deaf family members they had once struggled to talk to. Others simply wrote, "I finally feel seen." Rosa sat beside her son one evening, scrolling through messages with tears in her eyes. She pointed to one that read, "I watched your story with my daughter. She was born deaf. For the first time, she said she feels proud." Rosa smiled, her voice soft as Luis interpreted for Ethan. "You did this, mijo." Ethan shook his head gently. "We did this," he signed. "All of us who were never heard before." Meanwhile, Keanu's silence continued to speak volumes. Without a single post, his name trended for weeks. Fan pages posted old clips of him volunteering in hospitals, giving up subway seats, or comforting strangers. People called it the evidence of a consistent soul. He became unintentionally a symbol of quiet leadership, someone who led by example rather than words. At the same time, corporate organizations began responding. Television networks introduced accessibility programs. Streaming platforms added ASL interpreters for live events. Even Hollywood, so often accused of vanity, began hosting workshops about authentic inclusion. One magazine headline summarized it perfectly. He didn't change the world by speaking. He changed it by listening. By the end of the month, an entire generation of young viewers had learned the sign for thank you because of one unscripted moment. And for the first time in modern entertainment, silence had become something beautiful, something powerful. Deaf children across the world watched the clip over and over, mimicking every movement of Keanu's hands and Ethan's expression. And when they signed the same words, "You're doing great, I understand," they finally believed them. It had been 6 weeks since the night that changed everything. The world had moved forward, but its echo still lingered. News outlets still mentioned it, schools still showed it, and millions continued to learn the gestures that had bridged a gap wider than sound. Now, the network behind America's Got Story had invited Ethan and Keanu back for a reunion special. An episode meant not to entertain, but to celebrate what one simple act of understanding had set in motion. The day of the taping arrived quietly. The studio looked nothing like it had before. The stage that once gleamed with bright lights and flashing graphics now carried a humbler, more meaningful design. Large digital screens displayed captions in real time. A row of sign language interpreters stood at both sides of the platform, ready to translate every spoken word. For the first time, silence itself had been built into the production. When Ethan stepped into the building, his breath caught. Everything around him, the signs, the interpreters, the accessible seating, had been designed with care. He could see himself reflected in this new version of the show. He had once been the contestant that no one understood. Now, the entire set was built to ensure no one else would ever feel that way again. Backstage, Keanu waited by the curtain, dressed simply in a dark suit with his hair tied loosely back. He greeted every crew member with a smile and a quiet nod, signing thank you to the interpreter who introduced herself. He wasn't here to be the star. He was here to honor the change that had begun with Ethan's courage. As the countdown began, the hosts took their positions at center stage. Lana Torres adjusted her earpiece, her expression softer than usual. When the red light above the camera blinked on, she smiled into the lens. "Good evening, everyone. Tonight's episode is unlike any other because of one moment of understanding, one act of compassion that reached across silence. We've partnered with schools across the country to make sign language part of the national curriculum." The audience erupted in applause. On the big screen behind her, clips of classrooms filled with children signing "Thank you" and "I understand" played in a moving montage. Subtitles appeared automatically, making the message clear to everyone watching, hearing or not. "Please welcome," Lana continued, her voice trembling slightly, "the two people who started it all, Ethan Rivera and Keanu Reeves." The lights dimmed, and soft music began to play. The curtain opened, and the two men walked out together. Ethan, dressed in a simple gray blazer, signed "hello" as he stepped into the glow of the spotlight. Keanu followed beside him, giving a small wave before signing the same greeting. The crowd rose to its feet in a standing ovation. The applause was loud, but respectful, steady, and full of warmth. Some audience members lifted their hands in the air, signing applause in silence, filling the room with a shimmer of movement rather than noise. When the sound began to fade, Ethan turned toward Keanu, smiling. He signed, "Thank you." Keanu smiled back and replied in kind, "You started this." The audience watched the exchange on the large screen, where every sign appeared with caption translation. For the first time, no one had to guess what was being said. Every viewer could understand. And then, as the music faded away, the studio fell into that familiar stillness, the same kind that had defined their first meeting. But this time, it wasn't confusion that filled the air. It was respect. The applause slowly quieted, leaving behind a hush that felt almost sacred. Lana stepped forward again, her voice softer now. 6 weeks ago, a man stepped on this stage to tell a story that didn't use words, she said, her eyes glistening. Tonight, that story has become a movement. Behind her, the big screen came to life once more, showing clips of real classrooms, children signing greetings and morning announcements, families at dinner tables communicating in sign language, even firefighters learning basic signs to use in emergencies. The audience watched in silence, many wiping their eyes. The caption on the screen read, "Listening begins when we stop trying to be heard." Ethan looked at the footage, his eyes wide. He turned to Keanu, signing, "I never thought this could happen." Keanu's answer was steady, simple. "It happened because of you." The crowd broke into another round of applause. Keanu raised a hand, gently signaling for calm, and then turned to the audience. His voice was calm, clear, and heartfelt. "This isn't about one night," he said. "It's about what happens when we choose to understand instead of react." Ethan's story reminded us that communication isn't just sound. It's empathy. It's time. It's presence. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. He taught us that silence isn't the absence of communication. Sometimes, it's the purest form of it. The audience sat motionless, taking in every word. Camera zoomed in on Ethan, who was blinking back tears. He signed, "You listened when no one else would." Keanu shook his head softly. "You made us all listen." The host stepped closer, visibly moved. "Ethan," she asked, "what would you like to say to everyone watching tonight?" Luis, standing beside him as his read-in interpreter, signed the question. Ethan smiled, took a deep breath, and began. His hands moved gracefully, his expressions shifting with emotion. Luis translated his words aloud. "I want to thank my mother, who gave me my first voice. I want to thank everyone who decided to learn, even one sign. But most of all, I want to thank this man," he said, turning to Keanu. "He showed the world that listening can change lives." The camera panned out as the audience rose again, many now signing thank you toward the stage. The gesture spread like a wave through the crowd. The lights softened, and soft piano music began to play. Ethan and Keanu stood side by side under the spotlight once more, just as they had the first time. But now, it wasn't a moment of confusion. It was transformation. As the broadcast ended, the camera lingered on their hands. One pair older, one younger, both moving together in the same rhythm, signing the same word: hope. The reunion special aired to record-breaking ratings. Across America, people wept, learned, and signed along. Yet, as with every wave of admiration, a shadow soon followed. Within days, the same digital spaces that had once celebrated the moment began to fracture. Online commentators emerged, their words sharp and dismissive. Some accused Keanu of virtue signaling, claiming the entire event had been orchestrated for publicity. Others mocked the movement itself, suggesting it would fade as quickly as any other social trend. A few went so far as to write, "Give it a month, and everyone will be back to forgetting the deaf community exists." Headlines clashed in contrast. One read, "Keanu's gesture restores faith in humanity." Another countered, "Hollywood's empty heroics, was it all a show?" Keanu saw the divide unfolding, but he didn't react. He didn't post a statement or grant interviews. While others argued, he chose quiet once again. That week, his assistant, Mark, entered his home holding a stack of newspapers. "You're trending again," he said, half amused, half frustrated. "Half the internet thinks you're an angel. The other half thinks you're a fraud." Keanu looked up from his notebook, where he'd been jotting ideas for his foundation work. He smiled faintly. "Then maybe both halves are wrong," he said calmly. Mark sighed. "You could respond, you know. One good interview, one thoughtful post. It would silence them." Keanu shook his head. If I speak to defend myself, I'll make it about me. It never was. He closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair, his expression peaceful. I don't need them to understand. I just need to keep doing what matters. And so he did. 2 days later, without announcement or cameras, Keanu drove to a small school on the edge of Los Angeles, a place few knew existed. The Riverside Learning Center for the Deaf was a modest building, painted sky blue, its walls covered with children's handprints in every color imaginable. He parked quietly, wearing jeans and a simple gray sweater, and stepped inside carrying a small box. The receptionist gasped in surprise, but quickly smiled when he pressed a finger to his lips and signed hello. Moments later, the principal, a woman named Clara Jensen, greeted him. Her hands shook as she signed. "We didn't know you were coming," Keanu replied with a grin. "That's the point." She laughed, still stunned, and led him toward the gymnasium, where a storytelling workshop was underway. Inside, a dozen children were gathered in a circle, moving their hands rhythmically as they signed short stories about their families and dreams. When Keanu entered, the room went still. One little boy dropped his hands mid-sign, his mouth forming the silent words, "It's him." Keanu knelt to their level, smiling gently. "May I join you?" he signed. The children erupted in excited movement. Their teacher nodded quickly, eyes bright with disbelief. Keanu sat cross-legged among them, setting the box beside him. Inside were props, small toys, colorful scarves, and puppets for storytelling exercises. Keanu opened the box and placed the scarves and puppets on the floor in front of the children. He picked up a small wooden bird and signed, "Let's make a story together." The children's faces lit up. Their hands moved rapidly, building ideas in a whirl of imagination. One child signed about the bird, flying across oceans. Another added a mountain. A third introduced a rainbow that could sing. Keanu followed their rhythm easily, adapting his gestures, making faces, laughing silently when they teased him for signing too slowly. The teacher, standing near the back, watched with her hand pressed to her mouth. For many of these children, this was the first time they had seen someone from the outside world, someone famous, meet them on their level without hesitation or pity. Keanu wasn't performing for them. He was simply being with them. At one point, a little girl tugged on his sleeve. She had long black hair tied with a pink ribbon and bright brown eyes that shone with mischief. She signed shyly, "You're famous." Keanu chuckled, tilting his head as he signed back, "No, you are." The class burst into laughter, a ripple of joy that filled the room even without sound. The little girl grinned proudly and began her own story, signing about a girl who could make flowers bloom just by smiling. Keanu pretended to be one of the flowers, bowing dramatically every time she smiled at him, sending the children into another wave of laughter. The teacher couldn't hold back her tears anymore. She wiped them quickly, not wanting to draw attention, but Keanu noticed. He smiled at her and signed, "Thank you for teaching them. You're the real storyteller here." She shook her head. Her reply came slowly, but every motion carried emotion. "No, you gave them something no one else ever did. You gave them hope." Keanu lowered his gaze humbly. "They already had it," he signed back. "I just reminded them." When the workshop ended, the children crowded around him, each wanting to show their sign names, the personalized gestures that represented who they were. One boy signed the letter E traced over his heart. Another made the motion of a star. Keanu memorized each one carefully, repeating them back so he wouldn't forget. Before leaving, he reached into the box and pulled out a small stack of notebooks. Each cover had the words "Hands Tell Stories" printed across it. He handed one to each child and signed, "Write your stories here. Every one of them matters." They nodded eagerly, hugging the notebooks to their chests. As Keanu stood to leave, the entire class lifted their hands in the air and signed thank you. The sight froze him in place for a moment. It reminded him of the night he had stood next to Ethan on stage. of that same wave of gratitude rippling through silence. Outside, Clara walked him to his car. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. "You don't know what this means to them," she said softly. Keanu smiled. "I think I do." She nodded, then added, "You didn't just visit Mr. Reeves. You gave them something to believe in." He paused with his hand on the car door. "They already believe," he said gently. "I just wanted them to see that the world is finally starting to believe, too." When he drove away, the children ran to the fence, waving. Their small hands shimmered in the afternoon sun, forming silent farewells. And somewhere in that quiet, amid the rustling of leaves and distant laughter, Keanu realized that criticism didn't need to be answered, only outshined. By the time spring arrived, the movement had spread far beyond anything Ethan or Keanu could have imagined. What began as a single act of understanding on a television stage had turned into a cultural shift, a quiet revolution that reached classrooms, workplaces, and public spaces across the country. Across the nation, high schools adopted something new: Silent Storytelling Day. Once a month, students spent one period communicating entirely through gestures, expressions, or writing. Teachers reported that it changed more than how students interacted. It changed how they listened. One teacher in Seattle said, "For the first time, I saw students looking into each other's eyes instead of down at their phones." Restaurants followed suit. Chains and local diners began training their staff in basic sign language to better serve deaf and hard-of-hearing customers. Small cards appeared on tables that read, "We're learning to listen differently. Thank you for your patience as we grow." Some patrons came just to experience the change. It wasn't about food anymore. It was about connection. In downtown Chicago, a cafe called The Quiet Cup became famous after its employees, all hearing, learned to take orders using sign language. Videos of the staff signing coffee, please and thank you spread online, drawing crowds from across the city. The owner said, "It's amazing how much warmer the world feels when words are replaced by kindness." Hollywood noticed too. Celebrities began joining the movement, learning simple signs for love, respect, and inclusion. Some recorded short clips on social media, encouraging fans to learn one new sign each day. A video of Dwayne Johnson signing family went viral, followed by a clip of Sandra Bullock signing "I understand" during a press conference. Talk shows began including interpreters on stage, and award ceremonies started adding subtitles during live broadcasts. For the first time in entertainment history, accessibility wasn't treated as an afterthought, it was celebrated as art. The producers of America's Got Story made a bold announcement that captured headlines nationwide. Starting with the next season, the show would include a new category dedicated to nonverbal performance, where participants could tell stories through gesture, movement, or silence. The statement read, "Because every story deserves to be heard, even if it isn't spoken." Ethan's life changed again, though he remained the same humble soul. Invitations poured in from universities, nonprofits, and international conferences. Everyone wanted him to speak, or rather, sign about his journey. But when a reporter asked how it felt to become the face of a global movement, Ethan signed simply, "I don't want to be the face. I just want people to listen with their hearts." That quote appeared everywhere. It became a slogan for empathy training programs, schools, and even corporate campaigns. But for Ethan, it wasn't a brand, it was truth. He continued teaching from his small studio in Bakersfield, holding weekly sign language workshops for kids and parents. On weekends, he volunteered at community centers, helping hearing families communicate better with their deaf children. Fame didn't change him. It amplified his purpose. And behind the scenes, Keanu was doing what he did best, turning inspiration into impact. Keanu had been watching everything unfold quietly from a distance. He saw the news headlines, the celebrity videos, the school programs, and he smiled, not out of pride, but out of gratitude. He understood that what had started as a single gesture had now become a chorus of compassion. But he also knew that for real change to last, it needed structure. That's when he decided to create something lasting. With the help of educators, linguists, and artists from across the country, he founded a new initiative called Voices in Silence. The program's mission was simple but profound: to give scholarships and creative platforms to deaf storytellers, filmmakers, and performers. The first branch opened quietly in Los Angeles. Its building wasn't grand, just a renovated community center, but the walls were covered with photographs of hands mid-motion, stories frozen in air. The plaque at the entrance bore only 5 words: "Gratitude is louder than words." At the launch, Keanu didn't invite the press. Instead, he invited students. 20 young storytellers from deaf schools across America gathered in the hall, some nervous, others bursting with excitement. When Keanu arrived, dressed in his usual simple attire, he signed, "This is your space now." One teenager, a tall boy with hearing aids and bright eyes, raised his hand and signed, "You're famous." "Why are you doing this?" Keanu smiled. "Because I know what it's like to be misunderstood," he replied, "and because you have stories the world needs to hear." The boy nodded, signing, "We'll make you proud." Keanu shook his head lightly. "Make yourselves proud. That's enough." Over the next months, Voices in Silence grew rapidly. Donations poured in not just from fans, but from teachers, parents, and artists who wanted to support the cause. The Parages program funded workshops, filmmaking grants, and traveling exhibitions where deaf creators could share their art. A few months later, one of its first scholarship recipients, a young woman named Ava, premiered a short film told entirely through sign language and movement. It won multiple awards at independent film festivals, and during her acceptance speech, Ava signed, "We don't speak to be heard. We speak to be understood." Keanu watched the clip online and smiled, recognizing the same strength he had seen in Ethan on that first night. The ripple had become a wave. Meanwhile, Ethan and Luis visited the new Los Angeles branch to meet the students. When they entered, the room erupted in applause, the silent kind. Ethan stood by the front, hands trembling as he signed, "This isn't mine, it's ours." Keanu joined him on stage, resting a hand on his shoulder. "No," he signed back. "You lit the first flame. We're just keeping it alive." The crowd's hands fluttered again in applause, a sea of shimmering fingers catching the afternoon light. It was no longer about fame, television, or headlines. It was about connection. About a world learning, one gesture at a time. That silence had never been empty. It had only been waiting to be understood. One quiet evening, weeks after the opening of Voices in Silence, Keanu found himself sorting through a box of old family belongings. It was late, and the city outside his window was silent, the kind of peaceful silence he had learned to appreciate even more in recent months. The box had been sitting untouched in the back of his study for years, filled with old photographs, handwritten notes, and mementos from his mother, Patricia. He hadn't opened it since before the pandemic. Tonight, something drew him to it. Maybe it was the way Ethan's story had lingered in his mind, or maybe it was the unshakable sense that the roots of his empathy ran deeper than he'd realized. He lifted the lid carefully and began to sift through the contents. Most of the photos were familiar pictures from his childhood in Canada. His mother smiling behind a camera, handwritten recipes, letters, and theater playbills from her costume design work. But buried near the bottom, folded neatly inside an old manila envelope, was something unexpected. It was a faded black and white photograph. The edges were soft, the ink slightly yellowed with time. It showed his mother, much younger, standing outside a small building with a sign partially visible in the background. Hilo Center for Deaf Children. She was surrounded by a group of kids, all smiling wide, their hands mid-motion in what Keanu instantly recognized as American Sign Language. His mother's hands were positioned in the sign, for love. He stared at the image for a long moment, barely breathing. A warmth spread through his chest. Part surprise, part understanding. His mother had never mentioned working with deaf children. Yet here she was, clearly fluent enough to be communicating effortlessly. He flipped the photograph over. On the back, written in her neat handwriting, were just 5 words. Listening isn't always with ears. The words hit him harder than he expected. It was as if she had left him a message across. Time a whisper meant for this exact moment in his life. He leaned back in his chair, holding the photo gently between his fingers. The connection felt undeniable. Maybe the empathy that had guided him all these years wasn't something he'd learned, it was something he'd inherited. He thought about all the times his mother had told him to look people in the eyes when they spoke. "That's where truth lives," she used to say. He thought about how she treated everyone, neighbors, waiters, strangers on the street, with the same calm kindness. And now, seeing her signing with those children, he realized she had lived by that same principle long before he ever understood it. Keanu smiled softly, his eyes glistening in the lamplight. He whispered, "You were listening too, Mom." Then he stood up, went to his desk, and cleared a small space beside his notebook, the same notebook where he had written, "Sometimes silence speaks the truth." He found a simple frame, polished the glass, and placed the photo inside. It sat perfectly next to the notebook, the 2 pieces of his journey, past and present, finally side by side. The next morning, the sunlight spilled gently across Keanu's desk, catching the edge of the photo frame. He sat down with his coffee, staring at his mother's smiling face, surrounded by the children she once helped. There was something timeless in her expression, something that mirrored the calm patience he had seen in Ethan, in Rosa, and in the children at the Riverside School. He reached for his notebook, flipping through the pages filled with ideas for voices in silence. Each line reflected his desire to do more, expand the program, reach more schools, create scholarships for teachers. Yet something inside him whispered that it wasn't enough to give. He needed to keep learning, to keep listening. That thought stayed with him all day. Later that afternoon, Keanu sat in his study, searching quietly on his laptop. He scrolled through websites for sign language academies, interpreter training programs, and deaf studies workshops. One listing caught his attention: Advanced Interpreter Certification Online and In-Person Hybrid Program, Pasadena. The description read, "For those seeking fluency, empathy, and a deeper understanding of visual communication." He smiled. It felt right. Without hesitation, he clicked Enroll. When the registration form appeared, he hesitated only once at the box labeled Name. After a moment of thought, he typed a simple alias, K. Page. It wasn't meant to hide who he was. It was a way to ensure no one treated him differently. No one turned his learning into a headline. He wanted to earn it, quietly. He submitted the form and closed the laptop, feeling a small, steady satisfaction. Over the next few weeks, he attended his first virtual sessions. The instructor, unaware of who he truly was, treated him like any other student. The lessons were demanding advanced syntax, cultural context, facial expression training, but Keanu found peace in the challenge. He spent hours each night practicing in front of the mirror, his hands moving with deliberate precision. He rediscovered the same humility he had felt decades ago in Vancouver, surrounded by children who had once taught him his first signs. Only now, he wasn't volunteering, he was the student again. Occasionally, during group breakout sessions, he connected with classmates from around the country. They didn't know his name, but they admired his focus. One woman signed to him after a class, "You have patient hands." He smiled, replying, "I'm still learning." Outside of class, he kept the photo of his mother close. Sometimes he caught himself glancing at it between practice drills, as if she were still teaching him. Every time his fingers stumbled, he'd remember her note, "Listening isn't always with ears." He never told anyone about the course. Not Mark. Not the press. Not even Ethan. It was his quiet promise to his mother, to the movement, and to himself, that empathy wasn't something to perform. It was something to live. Months later, when he received his certification, it came in a plain envelope. No one knew. He didn't frame it, didn't post it online. He simply slipped it inside his notebook, behind the page that read, "Sometimes silence speaks the truth." And that night, as he turned off the lights and glanced once more at his mother's framed photo, he whispered softly into the darkness, "Still learning, Mom. Always." The house settled into silence. Again, gentle, familiar, and full of meaning. The auditorium was filled to capacity. Rows upon rows of educators, journalists, producers, and accessibility advocates sat quietly beneath the soft golden lights of the National Conference on Accessibility and Media. It was the largest gathering of its kind in the country, and tonight's opening address was unlike any before it. At the front of the room stood a polished wooden podium with 2 interpreters flanking each side. A massive screen above displayed live captions in real time. The air buzzed with anticipation, yet there was a calm reverence among the crowd. Everyone knew who they were waiting for. Back near the last row, Keanu Reeves sat in his usual understated way, dressed simply, baseball cap pulled low, blending easily into the audience. Few noticed him, and that's how he preferred it. He wasn't here to be seen. He was here to listen. When the lights dimmed, the announcer stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice echoing softly, "please welcome our keynote speaker, Mr. Ethan Rivera." Applause spread through the room, followed by a wave of fluttering hands, the sign for silent applause. Ethan walked onto the stage slowly, his steps calm but purposeful. He wore a dark blazer, and his hair was tied neatly back. His interpreter, Luis, stood a few steps behind, ready but silent. Ethan paused for a moment at the center of the stage, looking out across the sea of faces. The audience waited expectantly. He lifted his hands, and the room fell completely still. His first signs were deliberate, his expressions carrying both humility and strength. "I once thought silence was my weakness," he signed. Luis spoke the translation softly into the microphone, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "I once thought silence was my weakness." The words echoed through the hall, followed by a quiet pause. Ethan continued, his hands flowing with grace. "I used to wish I could speak to be heard, to fit in, to make noise like everyone else. But then, I met someone who taught me that silence can heal." He gestured gently toward the audience, then paused, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed just for a moment on a man in the back row wearing a cap. Ethan smiled faintly, a knowing smile, and went on. "That man showed me that silence isn't emptiness. It's space. Space for understanding, for empathy, for truth." Keanu shifted slightly in his chair, lowering his gaze. He didn't move, didn't breathe too deeply. He hadn't expected Ethan to acknowledge him. He had come quietly, hoping to remain invisible. But now, hearing those words, he realized there was no hiding from something born of sincerity. Ethan took a deep breath, his hands slowing. "When I signed on that stage last year, I thought no one would listen. But one man did, and because of that, the world began to listen too." The crowd sat motionless, hanging on every movement. Some were already wiping tears from their eyes. Ethan's final words of the opening section came with the gentlest of smiles. "Tonight, I want to thank him, not with sound, but with the same silence he once shared with me." He lifted his hands and signed toward the doubler. Back of the room, "Keanu, will you join me?" A murmur spread through the audience as heads turned. Cameras zoomed in, searching the rows until they found him. Keanu hesitated for a moment, then sighed quietly. He removed his cap and stood. The crowd parted as Keanu walked down the aisle, the low hum of excitement replaced by awe. There was no fanfare, no music, just the sound of footsteps against the polished floor. Every face turned toward him, but his eyes stayed fixed on Ethan. When he reached the stage, Ethan extended his hand. Keanu took it, giving a quiet nod of respect. The two men stood side by side, and the hall fell into complete silence once more. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every subtle motion. Ethan turned to him and signed softly. "Thank you for coming." Keanu signed back. "You didn't need to ask." The audience watched, spellbound, as the interpreters stood motionless. They weren't needed for this part. The language of understanding had already been learned. Ethan raised his hands again, signing for everyone to see. "I once believed silence separated us." He paused, then gestured toward Keanu. "But now, I know silence connects us." Keanu's expression softened. He looked out across the vast room and lifted his own hands. Slowly, deliberately, he began to sign. "Listening isn't hearing," he signed. Then, looking at Ethan, he finished. "It's understanding." The interpreters translated his words aloud. But by then, most of the audience didn't need them. They could feel what was being said. A ripple spread across the room. First a sigh, then a gentle hush of motion. One by one, people began to lift their hands, signing applause in the air. Thousands of fingers shimmered like light. It was the soundless cheer of a crowd that didn't need sound to express gratitude. Ethan looked around, tears shining in his eyes. He turned to Keanu and signed, "You taught me how to be heard." Keanu shook his head slightly, replying, "No, you taught the world how to listen." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The lights dimmed slightly, and the camera framed them together. Two men, one story, and a silence that carried more meaning than words ever could. When the host finally stepped forward to close the ceremony, she didn't speak right away. Instead, she lifted her own hands and signed "thank you" before saying softly into the microphone, "This isn't the end of a story. It's the beginning of a new language. The language of understanding." As the applause continued, Ethan turned to Keanu and whispered through his hands, "You kept listening." Keanu smiled faintly, "And I always will." The spotlight above them glowed brighter for one last moment, before fading into gentle darkness, leaving behind only silence. The kind that didn't separate people anymore, but held them together. 12 months passed quietly, yet the echoes of that moment on stage continued to ripple outward. What had begun as a small spark between two unlikely friends had grown into a nationwide movement that no one could have predicted. The Voices in Silence program had expanded to more than 100 schools and community centers. Thousands of students were now learning sign language, not as a special elective, but as a standard part of their education. Across the country, posters lined school hallways that read, "Listening isn't hearing, it's understanding." Children practiced signs for kindness, courage, and gratitude between classes. In workplaces, companies added interpreters to staff meetings. On television, news anchors introduced the day's headlines, using basic signs before speaking. The world had begun to look different. And it sounded different too, not because it was quieter, but because people were finally listening. The impact of Voices in Silence reached far beyond classrooms. Storytelling festivals now included nonverbal performers. Art museums hosted exhibitions featuring visual narratives from deaf artists. And every spring, cities across America celebrated Silent Storytelling Week, a tradition born from that first night on America's Got Story. Ethan had become a respected figure in education and accessibility, though he never saw himself that way. When reporters asked him about fame, he always smiled and signed the same phrase: "Fame is noise, listening is change." Luis, his lifelong interpreter and friend, often accompanied him on travels. Together, they visited schools and youth programs, teaching both children and teachers the power of expression beyond sound. At one event, a young boy signed, "I'm not afraid to be quiet anymore," and Ethan nearly cried. Meanwhile, Keanu remained in the background, as always. He refused interviews, turned down awards, and quietly funneled much of his own income into expanding the Foundation's reach. His focus had shifted entirely from Hollywood to humanity. When journalists did manage to catch a glimpse of him, it was often at unexpected places: a small community center in Oregon, a sign language recital in Texas, or a film school in Vancouver hosting deaf filmmakers. Each time, he kept a low profile, sitting in the audience, smiling, and clapping silently with his hands raised. The movement had also inspired something new in the entertainment world: a documentary titled Hands That Speak. Directed by a young filmmaker from the Voices in Silence program, the film chronicled Ethan's journey, the viral moment that started it all, and how one act of empathy transformed millions of lives. When the film was announced, the public's response was overwhelming. The premiere, set in Los Angeles, became one of the most anticipated events of the year. The red carpet was filled with artists, teachers, children, and families who had been touched by the story. But amid the flashing cameras and reporters, one person was missing from the spotlight: Keanu Reeves. He had arrived early, dressed simply as usual, slipping quietly into the back row of the theater before the crowd gathered. He didn't walk the red carpet or stop for interviews. He wasn't there for recognition. He just wanted to see what had grown from that single act of listening. The lights dimmed inside the theater, and the audience hushed. The first frame of Hands That Speak appeared on the massive screen, black and white footage of that unforgettable night on America's Got Story. Ethan stood on stage, hands trembling, signing his grandfather's story. The captions read, "Gratitude is louder than words." From his seat in the back, Keanu felt a familiar stillness wash over him. Around him, people leaned forward, completely silent, completely engaged. The film didn't use a narrator. It didn't need one. Every story was told through movement, through hands, through eyes. It was, fittingly, a language of emotion that didn't require translation. The documentary moved through time. The viral explosion, the interviews with families, the creation of Voices in Silence. Then it showed something that made Keanu's breath catch. Footage of his late mother, Patricia, at the Hilo Center for Deaf Children. The filmmakers had found the same photograph he kept framed on his desk and paired it with an archival clip of her signing with a young boy. The audience gasped quietly. The caption read, "Listening runs in the blood." Keanu's eyes stung, but he smiled softly. The connection had come full circle. The film continued, highlighting Ethan's workshops, Keanu's quiet philanthropy, and the ripple of change spreading across schools, homes, and hearts. In one segment, a classroom of first graders signed "Thank you" in unison. Another showed construction workers learning signs for safe and help. A reporter's voice, captioned on screen, said, "They didn't just start a movement. They started a new way of communicating." By the time the credits rolled, the theater was silent. Again, not out of formality, but reverence. Then, as if choreographed by instinct, the audience lifted their hands into the air, signing applause. The motion looked like a wave of light rolling through the darkened room. Ethan stood near the front, visibly moved. When the lights came up, the crowd erupted in cheers, both vocal and silent. Cameras flashed, people hugged, and children ran up to thank him. But through it all, Ethan looked toward the back of the theater. There, standing quietly, was Keanu. Ethan's face softened. He raised a hand, signing across the crowd. "You changed everything." Keanu smiled and signed back. "We both did." The cameras caught that moment, the exchange between two men who had started as strangers and become something like mirrors to each other. It was a moment that perfectly captured the essence of, quote, everything the film had tried to express. After the premiere ended, reporters swarmed the lobby. asking for comments. Keanu slipped out a side door into the cool night air. The city was quiet, lit by soft street lamps and the hum of distant traffic. Ethan caught up with him outside, carrying his jacket. They stood there for a moment, side by side, looking up at the marquee that read, "Hands That Speak Now Showing Nationwide." Ethan signed, "It feels bigger than us now." Keanu nodded. "That's how you know it worked." The two men exchanged a smile, one built from shared silence and mutual respect. Then Ethan looked toward the night sky and signed one final word. "Thank you." Keanu replied with the same gesture. The lights above flickered softly, and somewhere in the city beyond, children in schools, homes, and theaters were learning to do the same, lifting their hands toward understanding. The evening air carried the soft scent of blooming jasmine as the sun dipped low over the park. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and lavender, the kind of colors that seemed to belong to endings that weren't quite sad, just full of quiet meaning. Keanu sat alone on a weathered bench, his black jacket folded neatly beside him. The world around him had gone still, except for the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of city life. Ahead of him, two children played beneath the glow of the fading sun. One of them, a boy with messy blonde hair, was deaf. The other, a girl with a bright red hoodie, was hearing. They moved together in a rhythm that didn't need words. Their hands danced, their faces lit up, their laughter completely soundless but full of joy. Keanu watched them closely, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It reminded him of everything that had unfolded over the past year. The night on stage, the viral silence, the children learning to sign, and the faces of people who had learned to listen differently. It reminded him of Ethan's courage, Rosa's patience, and the countless classrooms that now spoke a language the world once overlooked. He leaned back on the bench, exhaling softly. A breeze swept through the park, carrying the faint sound of laughter mixed with birdsong. For a moment, he simply closed his eyes, letting the peace of the scene wash over him. Then his voice broke through gently, a calm, thoughtful reflection that felt less like speech and more like a memory being shared. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the loudest change begins in silence." The camera lingered on the two children as they continued to play. The boy signed friend, and the girl mirrored it back perfectly. They both laughed, their joy radiant and effortless. "When we take the time to understand one another," he said, "the world becomes fluent in kindness." The boy ran toward the swings, gesturing excitedly for the girl to follow. She nodded, laughing as she chased after him. Their hands moved quickly, full of expression and delight, a conversation of gestures that anyone could feel, even without understanding a single sign. Keanu smiled quietly, watching them. The camera shifted closer, capturing the lines on his face, softened by the golden light. He didn't look weary, he looked fulfilled. After a moment, he stood. The bench creaked lightly beneath him as he reached down for his jacket and folded it over his arm. He looked out toward the children one last time, his expression full of quiet pride. Then he turned to face the camera. He raised his hands and signed, "Thank you." Keanu's gesture lingered in the air, framed by the fading light. His movements were slow, deliberate, and filled with sincerity. The camera held on him for a long moment, the silence of the park, deep and comforting. Then, with a gentle nod, he turned and began walking down the narrow path that curved through the trees. The sound of footsteps on gravel blended with the whisper of wind through the branches. In the distance, the two children continued to play, their laughter carried only through motion, hands flickering against the dusky sky like fireflies. Keanu glanced back once, his smile faint but genuine, before the camera followed him into the growing twilight. "We spend so much of our lives talking," he said quietly. "We fill the air with noise, with opinions, with words that sometimes mean less than silence. But every now and then, We meet someone who reminds us that listening doesn't start with sound, it starts with presence. The image faded slowly to scenes from earlier moments in the story, Ethan signing on stage, the audience rising in silent applause, Rosa holding her son's hand backstage, and children learning their first signs in classrooms across America. The soft piano music underneath, built gently, each note echoing like a heartbeat. Keanu's voice continued, "I've learned that silence isn't empty. It's full of truth, waiting to be heard. And when we listen not with our ears, but with our hearts, we understand things words could never explain." The scene returned to the park, now bathed in deep blue twilight. Keanu reached the top of a small hill overlooking the city. Streetlights glimmered below like constellations fallen to earth. He stopped and stood there for a moment, breathing in the quiet beauty around him. The wind lifted slightly, brushing through his hair as he looked up at the fading streaks of color across the sky. The camera moved in close again, capturing his expression, peaceful, thoughtful, deeply human. He spoke once more, his tone tender but resolute. Maybe we can't fix everything. Maybe we can't change everyone. But we can choose to understand. We can choose to listen. And sometimes, that's enough to change the world. He lowered his gaze, eyes soft with reflection, and smiled. Again, small, almost imperceptible, but warm. Then he whispered the last line, barely audible. "The world doesn't need more noise. It needs more understanding." The music swelled gently as the screen began to fade. The camera captured one last image, Keanu walking away down the path, his silhouette framed by the final light of the evening. Behind him, the two children signed goodbye to each other, their laughter still visible even as the sound faded completely. Text appeared over the image, simple and white against the dusk. To learn more about American Sign Language, visit voicesinsilence.org. The music softened, replaced by the quiet chirping of crickets. The screen lingered there for a few moments longer, as if inviting the viewer to breathe, to sit with the silence rather than rush from it. Then, as the final piano notes faded into stillness, the closing text appeared. If this incredible story touched your heart, share it with someone who listens, with more than to power their ears. The camera faded fully to black, but Keanu's voice returned one last time, gentle, grounded, and full of gratitude. "Have you ever experienced kindness that needed no words?" he asked softly. Tell us your story in the comments below, and join us for the next incredible story. A moment of silence followed, intentional, powerful, and full of meaning. Then, the final frame appeared. Incredible Stories with Keanu Reeves. The logo faded slowly, leaving nothing but darkness and the faint echo of one unspoken message that silence, when shared with compassion, could move the entire world.